And welcome to the 100 Club. My name's Tom, joined by Rich once again, here to talk about the 100, and joined by a very special guest for this episode, who is Matt Roller. Matt, hi.
Hi, thanks very much for having me, guys.
You're more than welcome. For those who aren't aware, Matt, you've probably read some of his stuff because he is an assistant editor with ESPN CricInfo, perhaps the definitive source of cricket information on the internet, I would say, and the lead there for the 100. So we're going to have a chat about the 100. That's all right with you, Matt?
Absolutely. Let's get stuck in, guys.
Yeah, let's do it. So, it got off to a slightly sort of stop-start kind of beginning. The 100 had what I think the ECB might call a decent first year, maybe not perfect, but going into its second year, how would you see the state of the 100?
Wow, a broad one to start.
Yeah,
it's a very good question. I think you're 100% right that the ECB would sort of hail the first year as a success. I think I would tend to generally agree, but it depends again, sort of your general outlook on the game, I guess, and where people stand, what their priorities are. I think personally, the tournament in and of itself went as well as they could have pretty much possibly hoped, especially when you sort of consider the constraints of launching something as ambitious as what they have done in the the midst of a pandemic, having delayed it by a year. I think that obviously it will probably take 5 to 10 years to actually get a decent gauge on what it's going to do to the rest of the English game as a whole. I think particularly when you look at its sort of knock-on effects for example, England's test team, it's very hard to draw any conclusions about that after a single season. If you want to see what it's going to do to England's T20 team, I think exactly the same thing. It's going to take a long period of time to draw any conclusions about it. But I think what the ECB will have been pleased by will be firstly the sort of attendance and broadcast figures for the women's game in particular, having sort of stumbled upon the concept of double headers almost by accident, having initially planned to stage quite a lot of women's games as standalone events at sort of smaller county grounds. And also I think just sort of, the standard of competition and the buy-in from players having, there was obviously initially quite a lot of skepticism when the format was sort of soft launched, I guess, in 2018, a while ago now. But yeah, I think the standard was pretty high, and I think the players really bought into it, and I think that's pretty important going into this summer, which is obviously the second year.
I mean, covering domestic cricket here in England as you do, you obviously spend a lot of time going around the grounds. What's sort of been the general consensus of people this season when you talk to them about the 100? As you said, some were positive, others perhaps not quite so as much.
Yeah, well, it depends hugely on sort of where you go. I think, and also who in particular you're talking to. I think speaking to players, the majority of them are pretty keen on how the first year went. I think particularly women's players. I'm speaking to Alice Capsey at Surrey's Media Day a couple of weeks ago, and she obviously one of the breakout stars of it, is likely to benefit from it, playing it for 10 or 15 years or however long. And understandable why she would be positive about it. Otherwise, men's players, again, a bit of a split. I think some are really keen on it, particularly those who have done really well out of it. It's been someone like Laurie Evans before the draft. He was pretty excited by the whole thing. It's obviously been pretty beneficial for his career as well. I think if you look at some sort of senior county pros who are being overlooked for squads or whatever, some of them have a bit more, maybe a bit more resentful about it, especially behind closed doors. But yeah, and I think in terms of fans and anecdotally speaking to people I know in the game or whatever, it's a real mixed bag, because you have some people, coaches quite like it, especially those that are involved, because it's a good source of income for them. It's a high standard. It's something different, something fun in the middle of the summer. Some fans really like it. Some fans think it's the worst thing that's ever happened to English cricket. So yeah, I don't expect that sort of culture war that we've seen, I suppose, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in English cricket to stop anytime soon. I think that's going to keep going for the foreseeable future. But yeah, we'll see.
We love it, really. We love it, especially for my Somerset boys. But you mentioned Laurie Evans there. Clearly, as a beneficiary, as an advocate. You know, one of the 5 English players who went at the £125,000 bracket in the recent draft. And you mentioned it in an article as well, leading up to the draft, how the domestic players might benefit from availability and their ability to actually turn out for the full season this year. Do you want to just sort of give us an overview of what that was like, talking to agents, talking to players?
Yeah, so I mean, the upshot is that I think partly is sort of a COVID hangover because of the fact that obviously there was a period of the best part of 6 months where there was very little men's bilateral international cricket. A lot of series have been rescheduled for this summer, all for various points, which have pushed series back, meaning that there's never been a sort of clearly defined window in the same way as, for example, the IPL. But there was a bit of a gap originally in the Future Tours program for quite a few teams this year, which just doesn't exist at the moment. So almost every men's international team, I think, has a series of some sort that overlaps with the 100 this year. And I think basically what that's done is meant that for people like Lockie Ferguson, Babar Azam, David Warner, that's meant uncertainty over their availability. And what teams have, for the most part, done as a result is said, we'll take the hit this year. We'll get a slightly lower profile overseas player in a lot of cases, or someone that doesn't play international cricket anymore. We'll take the hit, and we'll secure some domestic talent that we can then retain for and have as part of our squad for hopefully 4 or 5 seasons. And instead, take that slightly I suppose smaller overseas name in terms of recognition so I guess if you look at Welsh Fire, they're probably quite a good example. They locked in Joe Clark and Tom Banton as their top 2 picks, who are both guys in their sort of early to mid 20s who they'll be hoping can be their opening partnership or part of their top order for 5 years at least. And instead they've rather than gambling on someone like Warner being available for the whole comp, they've said, well, we'll take David Miller, for example, at 75k rather than Warner at 125k, because we're pretty sure he's going to be available, because there's quite a good gap in South Africa's schedule if you don't play tests. They've gambled on someone like Naseem Shah being available at 60k, who's obviously young and exciting, but probably not a big name in terms of recognition. But the result is that there's obviously quite a few English players who maybe aren't as high profile as people would expect, who are earning quite a lot of money for 4 weeks. So someone like Liam Dawson is probably, laughing all the way to the bank with 125k that he wasn't quite expecting.
You were talking about the 2022 draft just then, and obviously it was delayed by, I think, a week or so because of the Shane Warne Memorial Service, and rightly so. But then what happened next was slightly odd in terms of doing the draft behind closed doors and then sort of drip feeding the results the day afterwards. And for a tournament that only lasts a month, it's really crucial to sort of have those high profile media moments earlier in the summer. So do you have any insight as to why the ECB did that?
Yeah, so from what I understand, it won't necessarily be the plan every year going forward. I think there's probably a recognition that it didn't quite go to plan this year in terms of obviously sort of interest in the draft. I think people who actually bought into the 100s first year were actually slightly underwhelmed by the fact these picks came out 24 hours after they'd actually happened, and sort of lunchtime on a Tuesday, I think it was. I think basically the reason that it was done was logistics. So the majority of head coaches who are actually making the picks were involved in the IPL, which would have been a problem regardless of the delay by a week. And even assistant coaches, analysts, a lot of them weren't in the country. So I think personally, I think there was a balance to strike between the first 2019 draft, which was all singing, all dancing, Sky Studios, 3-hour live show, versus what happened, which was a sort of slightly I suppose bizarre drip feeding of information, sort of death by press release. But I think in future years I would be surprised if they didn't try and put together some kind of package where they had even if not necessarily a live show, an as live show, so you got the idea of picks happening as they did rather than what actually happened, which seemed to me like a poor way to try and promote selection for the selections that the teams were making, because even though you had a bit of a hit in terms of the quality of names involved, you still have people like, I suppose Andre Russell's probably quite a good example. You could make it a pretty big thing that you've got a superstar of T20 cricket coming over and playing in the 100, whereas instead it just sort of was one of several press releases on a weekday. And yeah, I thought fell a little bit flat.
Trying to follow the live text blog on the 100 website it was slightly baffling. But as you say, though, some big names did announce, and plenty of players registered as well. So we've got some interest coming through there. I was surprised slightly to see the number of West Indian players who were picked up, particularly Karen Pollard, Dre Russ, Sunil Narayan as well. Did you get any feeling for their availability this summer? Because we obviously know, I think that they've got New Zealand visiting the West Indies this summer. Is there a particular tell that we think more of the West Indies players are going to play than we thought?
I suppose a few of them are sort of slightly different cases. So Russell and Narayan have both played and Narayan in particular, fairly limited international cricket in the past few years, just because of their sort of personal situations, I guess. And Bravo is obviously retired now from international cricket, so he should be available for the most part. I was really surprised, to be honest, that Pollard got taken as the first pick, because, from what I understand, West Indies are yet to confirm the dates, but they play, I think, India and some games in sort of July heading into early August, and they play New Zealand in August, as you say, and then the CPL starts at the end of August. So I think it's quite possible that Pollard won't play a game in the 100 this year. So I thought it was a pretty baffling first pick. I think the other guys, Russell, Bravo and Narayan, I would be surprised if they played fewer than sort of 5 or 6 of the 8 group games each, which I think teams are pretty happy to compromise on that, given what the availability was this year. But it definitely has been a massive talking point among teams, who's going to be available for how long for, all that sort of thing. So you can see certain teams like Northern Superchargers have gone with DJ Bravo, Faf du Plessis and Wahab Riaz, all of whom are sort of
aged,
35 plus and heading towards the end of their careers. But then I suppose that what they must be thinking presumably is having guys who are no longer sort of regulars for their international teams, but are still performing in franchise cricket, means that they should be available for the whole competition, which is clearly a major thing, because if you go for 3 guys in the prime of their career, then you might lose them for the whole comp to international cricket. So it's a really tough juggling act this year. And I think again, it's very important to have a strong domestic core, preferably of players that aren't going to get called up to Test cricket, because there are so many different availability questions to juggle, let alone, and that's even before you consider that there's very little stability at England's Test squad. So anyone really at this stage could get called up to the first 2 tests against South Africa.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. My bat remains ready to go. Rich.
I was just looking at sort of the general makeup of the different squads and how they put it together for year 2. I think in the first year, the final ended up being between quite 2 different styles in the way the Phoenix and the Bravo went about the 100. Sort of Phoenix a lot more kind of heavy metal cricket, big bash wallop, whereas Southern Break a bit more controlled, the Mahela ball approach. Do you think in year 2 we're going to see teams sort of coalescing around those styles, or do you think we're going to see sort of different ways being employed in the second edition?
It's a good question. I think you have a couple of teams, the 2 that you mentioned definitely already have sort of a clear or relatively clear identity. I think, having spoken to a couple of people at Trent Rockets before the draft and looked at the picks they had, they've said that they're sort of looking to go very sort of ultra attacking batting, which makes sense with the I think they signed 3 sort of top 5 batters, all of whom are pretty attacking, in Tom Kohler-Cadmore, Colin Munro and Ian Cobain in the draft. I think basically that there's a few teams that are sort of very much built to sort of, I guess, make the most out of home advantage. So Manchester are quite an obvious one there, because Old Trafford, when it doesn't rain, which is obviously a sort of big hypothetical in Manchester, but they've picked a side that has potentially, they could play 3 or 4 spinners, and it's a pitch that generally does spin. So I think in their ideal world, they'll be looking to win 3 or 4 of their 4 home games, and sort of doing what they can away. Then looks like sort of Oval have again prioritised quite a strong domestic bowling attack. If you look at sort of the Currans, Saqib Mahmood, Reece Topley, even Danny Briggs, who they got in the draft, that's again a sort of, I suppose, more towards Southern Braves sort of bowling heavy strategy. And then a few of the other teams, I mean, Welsh Fire, I suppose it depends how they go on their balance, because I don't know exactly who's going to bat 6 and 7. I think they've got a few different options there that could quite sort of considerably change the makeup of their side. But yeah, I think basically it will still be quite dependent on who each captain is, who each coach is, in terms of what style of cricket they want to play. I think I would be surprised if you had too many teams that were looking to just sort of knock it about and defend with a sort of ultra strong bowling attack. But I could see, for example, Southern Brave, like they did last year, rely heavily on their bowlers, and probably Oval to an extent as well. I think the other teams are sort of slightly more lean towards being batting sides, but yeah.
And the other factor that we've got that's new this year is the overseas wildcard pick that each of the teams is going to have. So a 4th overseas player potentially. Do you have an understanding of how that's going to work, or where teams might be looking?
Yeah, so I think that happens in the second week of June. I think basically so each squad will now have 4 overseas players, with a maximum of 3 playing it in a single game. With the sort of rough idea, I think that there were a lot of replacements last year where people were unavailable at certain times, and hopefully having an extra player in the squad means that if your fast bowler gets injured, you don't end up bringing in a domestic player because no one's able to fly in at short notice, and you can bring in an extra overseas player and maintain that quality. In terms of where teams are looking, I think again, sort of it's quite case by case. So I think I think the majority of teams will probably look towards signing a sort of fairly versatile player. So especially if you look at the guys who are overseas players in the Blast but not yet signed for the 100. So people like, I'm thinking Carlos Brathwaite, Dan Christian, both of them sort of bowling all-rounders who can fill various different gaps if an overseas player gets injured. Then also, I suppose there's people like Ashton Turner, Glenn Phillips in the Blast who might be seen as useful options in the middle order. And then a few teams, I'm looking at, I suppose someone like Trent Rockets they've got Rashid Khan, who they know is going to be unavailable for a fair bit due to Afghanistan commitments. So I wonder if their sort of overseas wildcard might be a wrist spinner who can come in and replace him, and then when he goes, they then replace him with a different style overseas player. So basically, they try and lock someone in rather than scrambling about during the tournament. But yeah, so I think from what I understand, I think that that wildcard will earn 50k, so a relatively low salary compared to most of the overseas players. So I think some teams will gamble on like a younger guy who might come back in future years. Some teams will just go with a sort of versatile, experienced guy who they know can be a backup member of the squad and is going to add a bit of experience and a bit of depth, and maybe a few extra options for in case someone gets injured or something like that.
So I guess my question would be, you're going to be up and down the country in August. I presume you'll be going to most of the games following this all. Who are you particularly looking forward to watching, player or team?
It's a good question. I mean, I think last year the one thing I was disappointed, the one game, the sort of ground I was disappointed not to have made it to during the tournament was Edgbaston, because that looked, I think they played on the hybrid pitches there, which were like incredibly high scoring, and obviously it's an amazing atmosphere even for T20 Blast games, England games, whatever. So I think I'd definitely really like to experience that, and they obviously had such a sort of fun, exciting batting lineup last year. So particularly looking forward to seeing them. In terms of players, it's a good question, really. I think I always like. I've always been a big fan of Sunil Narain, and I think he sort of showed some glimpses last summer of how exciting he can be, which I think he's someone, because of the fact that he's not actually played that much of his international cricket or T20 cricket full stop in the UK, he maybe sort of slips under the radar in terms of people's thoughts on who the T20 greats are. Whereas, yeah, I think he's such a legend of the T20 game that I think, he's a really exciting guy. So I think if Oval can try and make sure he's available for as much as possible of the season, and yeah, obviously he's going to go off to the CPL right at the end, but I think he'll play a decent number of games, and he's such a match winner, obviously with the ball, but then also if he can, if they use him as a pinch hitter again and he slogs a few at the top of the order, I think he's such a fun guy to watch, and I sort of hope that cricket fans in the UK get the chance to actually watch him in the flesh in a way that they probably haven't before. I think that'd be really fun. So those are probably the two in the men's comp. Yeah, Birmingham get up to Edgbaston at some point, and Sunil Narayan as a player.
Indeed.
Love it. I can't wait to add some Hasaranga to my summary for myself. But there you go, Matt. We're pretty much out of time, so I got to say thank you again. Also, I neglected to mention at the beginning, but many congratulations on recently winning ECB Krista Martin-Jenkins Young Cricket Journalist of the Year. That's tremendous. And if you want to follow more of Matt, he's on he's on Twitter at Matt Roller, and clearly I will put a link down below to all of your stuff on ESPN CricInfo. It's genuinely the best place to keep up to date with the tournament, barring of course the 100 Club.
Thanks you very much for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. Have a great summer.